Of our speaker this morning, I must say with deep regret that he is not an Orbis author. I wish he were. He is prominent among a band of scholars who have contributed to the new paradigm shift away from the Western Eurocentric understanding of the Christian story to an understanding of global or world Christianity. I was thinking about this yesterday, how it relates to what Eugene Kennedy described in terms of the shift away from an earth-centered view of the cosmos. Now, Kennedy said, we inhabit a wider reality. In the same way as Christians in North America, we are coming to see that we inhabit a wider Christian reality. That reality is the subject of Philip Jenkins' groundbreaking 1996 book, The New Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, which analyzed the face of Christianity in the next century and described the increasing shift in the center of gravity toward the south, particularly Africa and Latin America, involving new symbols, new styles of worship, and new ethical sensibilities. This was followed, among other books, by his 2006 work, The New Face of Christianity, Believing the Bible in the Global South, and in 2008, The Long History of Christianity, the 1,000-year golden age of the church in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and How It Died, which described the flourishing forms of Christianity that endured for centuries beyond the Roman sphere of influence and orthodoxy before they were largely overridden by Islam. These are only a few of the books Professor Jenkins has produced in a long and distinguished career. He was born in Wales and educated at Cambridge University, where he received a doctorate in history. Since 1980, he has taught at Pennsylvania State University, where he is currently the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Humanities. He is also a distinguished senior fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University. Despite his important works in religious history, he has also taught American studies and criminal justice and published in these areas. Altogether, he has published 24 books, including works on American history, criminology, the history of Wales, and an early book on the clergy sex abuse scandal in the church. His most recent book is The Jesus Wars, How 4 Patriarchs, 3 Queens, and 2 Emperors Decided What Christians Would Believe for the Next 1,500 Years, which deals with the incredibly vexatious and actually violent struggles to define the key Christological dogmas of the church, a struggle that makes the current budget deficit debates look like an ice cream social. His forthcoming book this fall is Laying Down the Sword, Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses, in which he points out that the Bible far outstrips the Koran in exhortations to violence. That should get a lot of attention. Please welcome Philip Jenkins.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. I have to say I do feel a certain sense of hostility in the program, because if you look at it, it has me followed by a barbecue lunch. What are people going to be concentrating on? So put that completely out of your mind. My talk this morning is called Keys of the Kingdom, the global church over the last 100 years and its future. And I want to explain, when David Brown shanghaied me into coming here today, we wanted to come up with a title, and I suggested this, and it's worked out to be very providential for a number of reasons, but above all because of the huge Chinese and Asian focus of Maryknoll from its early years. Now, as most of you I think will know, The Keys of the Kingdom is the title of a book by A.J. Cronin, of which, incidentally, we are celebrating its 70th anniversary this year. It's a 1941 novel, and a 1944 film with the very young Gregory Peck. And I want to suggest that if Maryknoll ever wanted to nominate an official film to explain its mission, this would be it. Because the film, and I'm sure many of you will have seen it, is about a dedicated Catholic missionary called Father Francis Chisholm, whose life precisely echoes so many of the heroic Maryknoll missionaries of the 20s and 30s, including some who died in China and Korea, like Father Cairns. And it tells the story of a man whose reputation is not known in his homeland, but when they investigate it, they find that he set up this astonishingly successful mission in China. And I can remember watching this film for the first time, I don't know, in the 1960s and 1970s, and thinking what an absolutely wonderful film this was, but how ridiculously detached from reality it was. Because it tells the story of this Catholic missionary, and it ends with a picture of a Chinese city in which there are all these Catholics, all these Christians. And of course, I know, from the point of view of the 1970s, that whole world was doomed to die. The film was made in 1944, round about the time that so many of these buildings were made with so many of their Chinese themes. But we know in 1949 that Chinese Christianity was going to perish. So you have to separate watching the film from what we know about the real world. That very dangerous concept, the real world. In 1949, there were 5 million Christians in China. How many are there today? Estimates vary. The lowest estimate you'll see that's plausible is 70 to 75. You will see people claiming 100 or 110 million. And Chinese Christianity faces a lot of problems. They have uncontrollable growth in so many areas. They have the problems of success. There's a wonderful recent book by a man called Nanlai Cao called Constructing China's Jerusalem, about how the great thriving city of Wenzhou is constructing itself as China's great Christian capital. And the problem is, looking at it, they have so many successful, rich people in the churches. The people called, and here's a phrase for you, the boss Christians. Lot of moral issues, lot of ethical issues. Is Chinese Christianity dead? No, far from it. In fact, on a typical Sunday, there are more Christians at worship in China than in Europe. So what I want to do today is I'm going to address a theme of euthanasia. Let me explain this quickly. Back in the 1840s, one of the founders of the English Protestant missionary movement was a man called Henry Venn. And in 1843, he said, "My goal is the euthanasia of the mission." In other words, he said, we are going to have missions, but in a few decades, the missions are going to die, and that's good, because then they will be churches. They will begin with foreigners in charge, but then they will become native churches. Once upon a time, he said, foreigners came to set up their missions on the banks of the River Thames. After a few decades, they were English people in charge on the River Thames. My goal, he said, in 1843 was the euthanasia of the mission. And if you look at Father Walsh and Father Price and their vision, what would they think of that next century, the century after 1911? And I think they would see huge successes, but perhaps not in any form that they might have recognized, because the missions succeeded so well that they died. There's a novel definition of success. So let's talk about what happened over the last 100 years. Well, let me go back a little bit before that. I'm going to begin this talk and end it with a prophecy, and a prophecy which can be verified. I'm sure you've heard the remark that there is no theological doctrine which can be verified empirically except for original sin. Well, I have a prophecy that you can verify empirically, and it goes back to the year 1640. 1640 was probably the worst year in European history before 1940. Protestants were killing Catholics, Catholics were killing Protestants, Christians were killing Jews. And the violence at the time, the warfare, was so extreme that many people thought that civilization might not survive in Europe. And at that point in 1640, a man called St. Vincent de Paul made a very interesting remark. He said, Jesus said his church would last till the end of time. He never mentioned the word Europe. The church of the future, he said in 1640, will be the church of South America, of Africa, of China and Japan. And I put it to you that that prophecy has, in our lifetimes, been fulfilled and is being fulfilled. Let me give you some numbers. I have to avoid the temptation throughout to avoid hitting people about the head with numbers, but some of them really do cry out for quotation. Around the world today, there are around 2.2 billion Christians, about a third of the world's population. And of those, the largest contingent is still theoretically in Europe, followed closely by Latin America, by Africa. But as we look at this story in the next few decades, the picture changes very rapidly. By 2025, the largest Christian continent will be Latin America, with Africa racing far behind. But by 2050, there's absolutely no doubt Africa wins. The most Christian continent by 2050 will be Africa. And once again, let's look at some numbers. Back in 1900, there were 10 million Christians in Africa, representing about 10% of the continent's population. By 2000, that 10 million had risen to 360 million, which is the largest numerical change that has ever happened in the history of religion. Within a few years from now, it will top 500 million, and by 2050, Africa should be home to 1 billion Christians, making it the largest Christian continent. By that point, Africa will be leading the story. In 1900, the story of African Christianity was largely a story of mission. During the 20th century, the mission was euthanized, and missions were replaced by churches. Look at the Roman Catholic portion of the story. I like to quote John Allen, an excellent writer, and he has some good figures of his own, and he points out that during the 20th century, the number of Roman Catholics in Africa grew at a rate of 6,700%. As I like to tell my students, for those of you who come from a humanities background, a liberal arts background, that's more than double. However, we also know one thing about these figures, which is they're wrong. They are understating the number of Catholics in Africa. You may have seen debates about when you say there are 5 million Catholics, 10 million Catholics, how do you know? What are the basis of the figures? Well, we recently have a very interesting study actually done at Baylor University. The official figure for the number of Catholics in Africa a couple of years ago was 160 million. A Baylor survey did detailed opinion poll data, and how do you identify yourself? And what they found was the Catholic Church was undercounting the number of Catholics, self-described, by 25%. They'd lost 40 million Catholics. So maybe that billion in 2050 is pessimistic. But I will tell you right away that St. Vincent de Paul's prophecy, and I use the word advisedly, is actually looking pretty good at the moment. And you look at some other growth rates. I sometimes tell my classes now, I want you to visualize a typical Catholic. What does he look like? Well, she looks rather different. Last year, for example, there were more Catholic baptisms in the Philippines than in France, Spain, Italy, and Poland combined. The largest Catholic populations in the world, despite Protestant inroads in some areas, are Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. And increasingly, as the century goes on, the Vatican's largest problem, and you could finish the sentence many different ways, but the Vatican's largest problem is that it is located 2,000 miles too far north to be near the center of the church. Or to put the story very simply, Christianity is a religion that was born on the continents of Africa and Asia, and in our lifetimes has decided to go home. If I was to project, as I try to do in my work, the figures here into the mid-century, let me project what the world's largest Christian populations would be in 2050, including all different denominations. Still at the head of the list in 2050 should be the United States, followed in no particular order by Brazil, by Mexico, by Nigeria, the Congo, Ethiopia, Uganda, the Philippines, and China. There may be some people in this room who remember a concept called Western Christianity, and Christianity ceased to be predominantly Western a good long time ago, and as we move to 2050 it becomes ever less so. Look at the Roman Catholic Church. As of 2000, at that point, some 2/3 of Catholics in 2000 lived in Africa, Asia, Latin America. By 2025, that number should be around 3/4, 75%. But there is a trick there, because that 75% does not include people from Africa, Asia, Latin America living in the global north. It doesn't include, for example, many people of Latino origin you will see in a town like Ossining. They do not exist in these figures. If you count people of global south origin, then by 2050 the Roman Catholic Church should be, I would say, at least 80% global south. That is a historic change and a dramatic change from the world of 1911. Well, as I often say, if this was just a story of the composition of the world's Christians being different in terms of ethnicity, of nationality, that would be an interesting factoid. It'd be the sort of thing you'd have on a USA Today graph. Well, clearly, it's more than that. Because as Christianity moves, in some cases, as it goes home, it acquires different cultural senses, different cultural connotations. And those cultural connotations might be very different from what you might expect. And what I want to do is just talk about some of the obvious ones here. I quote John Allen again. He says, the familiar boast of the Catholic Church is that it is one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. He sees the Church of 2050 as being global, uncompromising, Pentecostal, and extroverted. Well, let's look at some of those changes. For example, a lot of the questions that we thought had been solved a long time ago in theology are suddenly open again. The great scholar Andrew Walls, who is published, of course, by Orbis, makes the remark that if you have an interest in early Christianity, 2nd century Christianity, and you want to live that world, you can do one of two things. You can invent a time machine, or you can buy an air ticket to Africa. And the second is easier. What are some of the debates? The early church, as I'm sure you know, had a furious debate over what was the relationship between the Old Testament and the New. There were some people who wanted to kick the Old Testament out of the Bible. There were some people who thought that Old Testament law should still rule Christians. Eventually the church formed its answers by the 2nd and 3rd century, and those answers were completely settled right up to the 20th century, when the Old Testament arrived in Africa, where Africans in many societies were horrified and delighted to find a world they recognized immediately. There's a lovely story. There's a book from the 1930s called Africa Writes Back by a man who was a Ugandan prince at the time. And he describes how the missionaries came to his village and converted everyone and told them how they would have to live. And the people said, well, yes, this seems reasonable, except for this ridiculous law about banning polygamy. But if the church says, then we'll have to do it. And then somebody learns to read, and somebody learns to read the Bible, and the next time the missionary comes, the chief is ready. You said a man should only have one wife, but I've heard about a man called Solomon. And Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and he loved them all. What do you say about that? And the missionary says, well, yes, but that's the Old Testament. You told me that everything in this Bible was meant to be taken seriously. And the debate went on and on and on as people read the Bible. As they read the Bible, they found in the Old Testament especially a world that many of them knew, a world of nomadism, of polygamy, of paganism, of blood sacrifice, worlds that if they did not live themselves, their parents had and their neighbors did. What were they meant to do with the Old Testament? There's a South African feminist theologian, very liberal, very radical, called Maryknoll Masenya. And she makes a remark which I find interesting. If any African, she says, finds it hard to identify with the world of the Old Testament, they need to look very hard at themselves and wonder if they might not have lost their Africanness in some way. Could you make a comparable remark about that for Europeans or Americans? And so we live in one of the great ages of the rediscovery of the Old Testament. And the greatest danger of the Old Testament in many parts of Africa is that people take it too seriously. In the Sudanese church, for example, they're very reluctant when they translate the Bible into new languages to include the book of Leviticus. Why? Because when people read this, the danger is they find their society depicted. They find all the rules they need for life. What do they need with the New Testament? Leviticus is too dangerous. How does Leviticus feature in the Western church? I'm sure you've seen these arguments that go around about the internet about homosexuality, where someone will say, Leviticus says this, and someone will answer, well, yes, Leviticus includes a lot of old rules. It says that I'm allowed to own slaves from neighboring nations. Am I allowed to own Canadians? Portions of the Old Testament which have the least relevance in the West have the most relevance in many of the new churches. The argument is not convincing people that the Old Testament is to be taken seriously, but that it is not the beginning and the end of the story. Think about presenting Christianity to a society that takes the ideas of sacrifice and blood sacrifice very seriously. Christianity is based on ideas of sacrifice and atonement. Imagine if you are trying to present these to a largely secular Western society that knows nothing of these ideas. This is a strange, archaic thought world. In Africa, in contrast, everyone knows that ideas like sacrifice and atonement are to be taken very seriously, and what you then have to do is to slot in the idea that the final sacrifice is that of Jesus. Kwame Bediako, a great West African theologian, did a book on the epistles of the New Testament, and he wrote about many of them, but he ended with our epistle, Africa's epistle, which is what? Hebrews, which is all about the idea of sacrifice and atonement. He lived in a society called the Society of Ghana. The rituals of the year revolve around this great sacrifice called Odwira, and he has to explain Christ is the Odwira that ends all Odwiras. Theology is being rewritten in African voices, in Asian voices. And if you want to see this in practice, don't read books, no offense, listen to hymns. We live in the greatest ever age of Christian hymn writing, in languages that are inaccessible to most of us. They're in Yoruba, they're in Swahili, they're in Tamil. If you want to know what a church thinks, don't read what its leaders write. Listen to what the people sing. And if you listen to these hymns, not long ago an Anglican missionary was in the Sudan, and he said, I formed a project to write down all the hymns that have developed in this language in the last few years. Oh, wonderful, said a local bishop. My belief is there are between 12 and 15,000. But there are a couple which really stand out. And if you want to see what is the soul and heart of East African Christianity, look at a hymn like the Tuku Tendereza Yesu, which is the anthem of those churches across the board, and which is to those churches what something like Amazing Grace is to an American Protestant. What is this hymn? It's a hymn which is all about blood, the blood of the Lamb. By the way, very, very African symbol. Introduce that idea, the blood of the Lamb. Of course I understand this. And you're telling me Jesus is the blood of the Lamb. The blood of the Lamb shed for me. Praise you, Jesus. And this hymn has already attracted a huge body of stories about, it's the last song sung by martyrs facing the assassins of Idi Amin, and so on. We live in one of the great ages of the church. So many of the old themes, the old questions have reopened, and so many of the churches have these kind of very early issues to deal with. I mentioned Pentecostalism, and I don't so much mean the Pentecostal churches, although these are doing very well, but the whole idea of charismatic belief as something which runs across all the churches. Let me illustrate this by telling you a story. I want you to imagine a church in Uganda, in Africa. And this church has just had a very special service. Everyone is very stirred spiritually. And a woman wants to stand up in this church and report a healing she has just received of a long-running spinal complaint. So she gives testimony. And someone else stands up and gives testimony of how he has been healed. And somebody else. And it goes on and on. And eventually the deacon starts looking at his watch and wants to be out of there by next Sunday. And so he says, all right, put your hands down. Anyone who wants to report being healed of this kind of disease, put your hands up now. 16, 17. Okay, this kind of disease. I'm sure you've all seen this in your churches. What kind of church was this? Obviously, it was a Roman Catholic church, and the miracles happened during the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. Oh, by the way, the priest was also an Indian in Uganda. Welcome to the World Church. So many of the ideas which are in the New Testament have a pressing relevance, and especially ideas of healing. If you are looking at an African church, if you are looking at an Asian church, they are healing churches or they are nothing. And that is the most powerful part of their message. And by that, incidentally, I don't mean the kind of stereotype of faith healing that you often have in the West, but a healing of the body and the mind and the spirit and society integrated. So many Western Christians have this division between, there are different kinds of theology. There's liberation theology. Never heard of that at Maryknoll. There's liberation theology, which is about casting down injustice, the unjust works of power, creating social justice. But there is also deliverance, the idea of spiritual warfare, casting out demons, healing, and usually associated with a political right. Whenever I'm asked if people want to work with a rising church in Africa, what do they need to know? Basically, the two are one. And any church which offers part of the story without the other is missing a large part of the story. There's a remark which can often cause groans, but I will pass it on to you anyway, about the church, the Catholic Church in Latin America during the 1970s and 80s. The church opted for the poor. The poor opted for the Pentecostals. And that's the sort of line you can see on an exam paper with "discuss" after it. We can argue that out. But it's very interesting seeing how different churches have coped with this kind of charismatic Pentecostal challenge. And the most successful of all are the ones that have taken it on board and gone back to their roots. The country I'm very interested in is the Philippines. The Philippines is an overwhelmingly Catholic country, but unlike many other third world Catholic countries, it has not had a major Protestant challenge. Why? Because within the church you have developed these lay-led charismatic orders which offer everything that the Pentecostal churches offer combined with a basic Catholic teaching. You have these orders like El Shaddai, which operates in, last count, 36 countries. It has 6 million members. I always describe it as one of the world's great invisible churches. If you look at its services, it looks like a pure Pentecostal charismatic church, but it is Roman Catholic. Whenever you see poor Filipino people in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf, being subject to persecution, exploitation, overwhelmingly these are members of El Shaddai, a charismatic Catholic organization. So what are some of the issues that, I suppose, have arisen because of this shift around the world? One is the Old Testament, one is healing, and one is Pentecostalism generally. For me, one of the greatest of them all is the issue of poverty. Of course, as the church has grown, it has become a poorer church in terms of the average income of its members. If you take the billion poorest people in the world, those with an income of less than $2 a day, then by far the largest contingent of that is Christian. The poorest in the world are Christian, and that, of course, affects the way people read the Bible. You might have noticed one thing. You might have noticed that I'm speaking generally of Christians. Sometimes I'm talking about Catholics. One lesson that you do learn is that denominations and faith traditions matter much less. If you are living in a society where you represent a small proportion of the population, maybe 7 to 10%, like in many Asian countries, you define yourself as Christian. You do not define yourself so much as one particular denomination. If you are stopped at a checkpoint in Nigeria and you have a mob that stops you and says the standard question, depending who it is, They ask you, are you a Muslim or a Christian? But what they actually say is, recite the Shahada. Do you know the Muslim Declaration of Faith? And what Christian mobs will ask you is, what is John 3:16? Really good time to get your scripture in order. And your answer may decide whether you live or die. But you notice I'm speaking almost indiscriminately of Catholics and other Christians, or as the phrase goes in many parts of the world, are you Catholic or Christian? I'm sorry, honest, I'm just quoting this. Imagine how a poor church reads the Bible, or rather, as is most common, as in the early church, hears the Bible. And by the way, that's a big difference in the way you take aboard the information, because it speaks to a different part of the brain. I've tried to put together many of these different readings, but let me just tell you one story which kind of illustrates this. I was once talking to some Africans about the ways that the New Testament spoke to them, perhaps in ways that it couldn't speak to Europeans or Americans. And they mentioned a number of obvious ones in terms of living in an agricultural society. One was, there's that passage in Acts where you go to the market and somebody has a woman with a familiar spirit, with a demonic spirit. Oh, the number of times I've seen that, they said. You live in a different world. One story I thought was kind of indicative. Oh, but there's one passage, which is Psalm 126. And I sort of, again, summoned my scripture knowledge and finally gave up trying to understand why they were saying this. What is Psalm 126? Psalm 126 is the psalm about the man who sows his seed in weeping will bring home the sheaves again in joy. So you sow in weeping and bring the sheaves at harvest in joy. Now, you know the passage. It's used in the New Testament as an image of resurrection, obviously. It's often used in funeral services. Okay. Why does the sower sow seed weeping? So for my African friends, it was obvious. Well, obviously, they said. Word I hate. Obviously, they said. When the psalm was written, it was obviously just like back at home. There was a famine. And when there's a famine, you have this corn, but you have to make the big decision. It's been a couple of years of rotten harvests. You don't have much corn left, so what do? You feed the corn to your family, including your children who are hungry. But if you do that, you've got nothing to plant for next year. You lose your living as a farmer. You go off to the big city and become a beggar. So what you have to do is take the corn out of the hands of your hungry children and go sow it so you've got something to grow for next year. It's obvious. And it kind of occurred to me at that point that we were reading or hearing the Bible in different ways. I'm not suggesting that Global South churches have got some supernatural connection with the world of the 1st and 2nd century. But I am saying that a lot of the passages, a lot of the issues make sense in a way that perhaps they can't for me. I say nothing about you. Here's a challenge for you, or here's a question for you. Just suppose you had to find a biblical passage, a biblical text, which you wanted to introduce to people who knew nothing about Christianity. Now, there's a basic mission question for you. Suppose you had people who you knew to be Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, and you wanted to show them something. What would you take? What would you choose? There are any number of options you might choose. You might choose the Sermon on the Mount. You might choose some of the more mystical passages from the Gospel of John. I actually have a candidate for the most used scripture passage in mission around the world. And it's from the Epistle of James, and particularly it's James chapter 4. And and if you read this, James is a very, very strange letter. Christians haven't known what to make of it through the centuries. Martin Luther wanted James kicked out of the Bible. Very good recommendation, by the way. Here's a rule of faith. Look at the books that Martin Luther hated, and they're the ones that go down great in Africa. Okay, Luther had an impeccable sense. And there's a famous passage in James which goes something like this. You say that tomorrow you will go and do this. You'll go to this town. You'll go do this business. You fool! You don't know what's going to happen to you tomorrow. Your life is a mist. Your life is a vapor which arises and fades away. What you should say is, if God wills, I will do this. And I put it to you that that is around the world one of the most translated and most useful parts of the Bible. Muslims use it to try and convert Christians. Because if there's one thing you know in a Muslim society, it's that everyone says, if God wills, all the time. On a Middle Eastern airline, we will soon be rising to 30,000 feet, if God wills. Christians use it to convert Muslims. But above all, it speaks to poor societies where lifespans are short. You know, I deal with university students, all of whom know they are immortal. All of whom know they will be partying like it's 2099. Imagine reading a passage like that in a society with where a church congregation has an average age of 22, where the pastor is a grey-bearded old man of 29, and where the average age of death is 38. And there are such countries. Your life is a mist, your life is a vapor. Well, that certainly speaks true. Not long ago, a British publisher produced a series called Revelations, which was books of the Bible in the King James Version, so they didn't have to pay royalties, introduced by distinguished spiritual figures of our time, like Bono. And they included the Epistle of James. Who do you think wrote the introduction and commentary on the Epistle of James? The Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama said, I don't know much about Christianity. I do know a lot about Buddhism. This is wonderful Buddhism. This passage here, your life is a mist, your life is a vapor. This perfectly encapsulates what Buddhism is all about. You call it wisdom literature. We have a phrase for it in our religion, which is mind training. It's based on the fact that you are going to die. How does your life, the rest of your life, revolve around this basic fact? So what I'm suggesting to, I suppose, to draw to a close is this. The church, how are we doing for? Well, we have a few minutes before the barbecue, honestly. The church is changing very rapidly. Now, churches are growing very fast. Please understand what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting some kind of miraculous conversions around the world. A large part of this is a demographic shift. If you have a society where, say, 50% of the people are Christian, and that society gets a lot larger, you will have more Christians. For instance, an area I'm interested in is East Africa. Back in 1900, the three countries that represented Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania had about 8 million people. By 2050, those same countries will have 250 million people. But as Father Walsh and Father Price realized, if you invest in areas early, it's not exactly compound interest, but those long-term investments will grow. Yes, there are more converts. Yes, but mainly you're dealing with a demographic phenomenon, which is why Christianity will continue to boom. Different churches around the world have done well or badly on this, depending on how global they are, how international they are. And I'll just describe one experience before I come back to the Catholic. I have a great respect for a church called the Seventh-day Adventists. small evangelical Protestant church. Listen to this as an experience. Back in the late 1950s, for the first time ever, there were 1 million Adventists, overwhelmingly in the United States. There are still 1 million Adventists in the United States, but there are now 14 million in the rest of the world. Oh, and that million in the United States are overwhelmingly Caribbean, African, and Asian. And I look at some of the older Adventists, the people who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and I feel such sympathy for them because these are the most decent, welcoming people in the world. But in a sense, their church is not theirs anymore. And they will never say a harsh word about this. But you know what happened when they sent those Bibles around the world, included that line, "Go and make disciples of all nations," and wouldn't you know, they tried, and they did it. And I feel so sympathetic for other churches in this country which have seen their churches radically transformed by success. Where you have parishes in the United States which have become African, which have become Latin American, where the priests are Vietnamese or Nigerian, and it's a transformed world. But to use a phrase, you know that field afar? It isn't afar. It's the field afar right here. Some churches expand and succeed and have many controversies. Some churches remain just the same they are, and the sound you can hear is them dying. And the Roman Catholic Church is one that is surviving and booming, and will spend the next 50 years fighting very hard about the implications of this, but it's much better than the alternative. I want to end with a quotation. As you see, I follow the theory that lecture notes are for sissies. However, I hope you will bear with me if I just read you one quote. It's one of the most famous quotes about the Roman Catholic Church. From 1840, and in 1840 there was a great history of the popes written, and the English writer Lord Macaulay wrote something about it. And you've got to remember, at the time, 1840, most English people, most English Protestants hated the Roman Catholic Church. But listen to what Macaulay said, and listen to this first. The Catholic Church, 1840, is still sending forth to the farthest ends of the world missionaries as zealous as those who landed in Kent with Augustine, and still confronting hostile kings with the same spirit with which she confronted Attila. The number of her children is greater than in any former age. Her acquisitions in the New World have more than compensated for what she has lost in the Old. Can I read that one again? Her acquisitions in the New World have more than compensated for what she has lost in the Old. Have we lost Europe? Hey, there's a whole world out there. And I just read this final passage. The Church. Nor do we see any sign which indicates that the term of the papacy's long dominion is approaching. The Church saw the commencement of all the governments and all the ecclesiastical establishments that now exist in the world, and we feel no assurance that she is not destined to see the end of them all. She was great and respected before the Saxons set foot in Britain, before the Frank had passed the Rhine, when Greek eloquence still flourished at Antioch, when idols were still worshipped in the temple of Mecca. And the papacy, the Church, she may still exist in undiminished vigour when some traveller from New Zealand shall, in the midst of a vast solitude, take his stand on a broken arch of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's. Empires fall, kingdoms fall, churches survive and grow, but they survive and grow because of what? Their missions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Philip Jenkins. for that wonderful reflection on Christianity.